Hey guys, tonight we're doing something slow, something cold, something deeply uncomfortable but in a very historical way. So go ahead and dim the lights, lower the volume just a little more than usual. Get yourself into that position where your body absolutely refuses to move again. And let's talk about how medieval peasants survived winter. Somehow. Repeatedly. For centuries. Without heaters, insulation, or even the basic courtesy of dry socks. Because while kings were busy freezing dramatically in castles with tapestries and wine, peasants were out here like, yes, this mud floor is fine. I will simply not die today. And honestly, that was the goal. Just not dying. So let's gently drift back to medieval Europe, somewhere between the 9th and 14th centuries, where winter wasn't a season, it was a personality, and it did not care about you. Medieval winter arrived slowly, quietly, and then stayed too long. Kind of like a house guest who eats all your food and refuses to acknowledge personal boundaries. By late autumn, the days were already shrinking. Sunset crept earlier and earlier until daylight became a brief, disappointing cameo. The air turned damp before it turned cold, which was somehow worse. Cold you can brace for. Damp just seeps into your bones and sets up permanent residence. For peasants, winter meant the end of movement. Fields went quiet. Roads turned into mud traps. Travel slowed to a crawl, and the world shrank down to a handful of familiar paths between home, barn, and church. If you had a barn. Most peasants lived in small, single-room houses. No chimney, no insulation, no separation between humans and animals. Just vibes. Cold, smoky vibes. These houses were usually built from whatever was available. Wood, wattle and daub, mud, sometimes stone, if you were lucky or very stubborn. The roof was typically thatched, which looked quaint in summer and became a sponge in winter. Rain soaked in, snow piled up, wind slipped through every crack, and the whole structure slowly inhaled moisture until everything inside felt permanently damp. Inside, the floor was usually packed earth. No wood planks, no rugs, just dirt, which froze or turned to sludge depending on the day. Furniture was minimal. A bench, a table, maybe a chest. Beds were often straw-filled sacks laid directly on the floor. If you've ever slept on straw, you know it's loud, itchy, and aggressively unsympathetic. Now imagine it's slightly wet. That's winter. The hearth was the center of everything. It provided warmth, light, and a place to cook, but it also filled the room with smoke. Without a chimney, smoke escaped wherever it could, through holes in the roof, through doors, through your lungs. Eyes burned, throats stayed sore, coughs became permanent companions. But the fire had to stay lit, because once it went out, getting it going again was a problem. Wood fire was precious. It had to be gathered months in advance, usually during summer and early autumn, when people were already busy not starving. Wood was stacked carefully, protected from rain, counted mentally. Every log was a decision. Burn too much, and you freeze later. Burn too little, and you freeze now. Fun choices. At night, peasants clustered close to the fire, not because they were social, but because heat didn't travel very far. Everyone wore layers. Wool tunics, cloaks, hats indoors, socks if you had them. Wool was the MVP of medieval winter. It stayed warm when wet. It lasted forever. It itched relentlessly. Peasants slept fully clothed. sometimes under rough wool blankets, sometimes under cloaks, sometimes with animals nearby, because body heat is body heat, and dignity was optional. Chickens might roost inside, a goat might be tethered near the door. Cows sometimes shared the space, separated by nothing more than hope. Animals weren't pets, they were heaters that occasionally kicked. The smell was present, constant, unavoidable. Manure froze in winter, which helped a little. At least it didn't smell as much when it was solid. Silver linings. Food during winter was repetitive, painfully repetitive. Fresh vegetables were gone. Fruit was a memory. Herbs were dried months ago. Meals revolved around what could survive months in storage. Grain, beans, turnips, cabbage, salted meat if you were lucky. Bread was everything. Dark, heavy bread made from rye or barley. Wheat was expensive, and mostly for people with titles. Porridge was common. Stews simmered slowly, stretching tiny amounts of meat across many days. Flavor was not a priority. Calories were. Salt was essential. Without it, meat rotted. With it, meat became tough, dry, and aggressively salty. But it kept you alive. Kind of. Winter hunger wasn't dramatic starvation. It was slow thinning. Meals got smaller. Bodies weakened gradually. By late winter, people were tired. Always tired. Skin cracked. Lips split. Coughs became permanent companions. Children were especially vulnerable. Many didn't survive their first winter. And peasants knew this. They expected it. There were no emergency supplies, no backup plans, no government assistance. If the harvest had been bad, winter was brutal. If it had been good, winter was merely unpleasant. Snow made everything quieter. Fields disappeared under white blankets. Paths vanished. Sounds softened. But cold was relentless. It seeped through walls, through shoes, into joints. Frostbite wasn't dramatic, it just happened. Fingers stiffened, toes lost feeling, skin turned pale, then dark. People didn't rush to doctors. They wrapped cloth around it and hoped. Church bells marked time. Sundays broke the monotony. Church interiors were barely warmer than outside, but at least they were communal. Everyone gathered. Everyone coughed together. Everyone smelled the same. Faith mattered more in winter, not because answers came, but because hope had to live somewhere. Winter nights were long, unbearably long. Without artificial light, darkness arrived early. Candles were expensive. Tallow candles smoked and smelled. Most evenings were spent sitting quietly, talking softly, mending clothes, staring into fire. Stories were told, old ones, repeated ones. People went to bed early, not because they were rested, but because staying awake was cold. Sleep came in fragments. Fire needed tending. Animals shifted. Wind howled. Dreams were short. Morning brought no relief, just another gray day, another calculation of wood and food. Winter wasn't dramatic for peasants. It was exhausting. It was endurance. They didn't romanticize it. They didn't complain much either. This was life. This was normal. So let's ease back into the village again, slowly, without any sharp noises. Same place, same people, same low gray sky that seems to have been installed permanently. One of the strange things about medieval winter is that it didn't really begin with snow. Snow is memorable. Snow feels like an event. Winter, for peasants, usually began with rain. Cold, soaking rain that arrived in late autumn and quietly ruined everything. Clothes got wet and never fully dried. Roads turned into thick, ankle-grabbing mud. Houses absorbed moisture like unhappy sponges. By the time the first snowflakes finally showed up, people were already chilled, already exhausted, already a little bit sick of the whole situation. Snow at least had the decency to be dry, but winter illness preferred dampness, and medieval villages were perfect environments for that. People lived close together, often several generations in one small room, sharing air, smoke, breath, and whatever germs happened to be passing through. No one had any idea what germs were, of course. Illness was blamed on bad air, unbalanced humors, or God being in a mood. In a way, that explanation was comforting. If sickness had a cosmic reason, then it wasn't random. It wasn't just bad luck. It was part of the order of things, even if no one could explain the logic behind it. Coughs were everywhere, persistent, rattling coughs that never quite went away. Smoke from hearth fires filled homes day and night, irritating lungs that were already tired from cold air. Eyes burned, throats stayed sore. Children developed coughs that sometimes faded with spring and sometimes didn't. Older villagers often weakened quickly once winter set in, their bodies simply unable to hold on to warmth and strength at the same time. When someone fell ill, they didn't isolate. There was nowhere to go. They stayed home, which meant staying in the same room as everyone else, breathing the same air, wrapped in the same smoky warmth. Care was simple. Warm drinks if herbs were available, extra blankets if there were any to spare, prayers said quietly, sometimes hopefully, sometimes out of habit. Then came waiting. Sometimes the illness passed, sometimes it lingered, sometimes it ended things. Winter didn't dramatize death, it made it quiet. People faded rather than collapsed, and life continued because it had to. Work never stopped entirely. Animals still needed feeding, firewood still needed to be carried, water still had to be fetched, sometimes through ice. Cold made every task heavier. Tools were painful to grip, leather stiffened, fingers lost flexibility. A job that took 10 minutes in summer could take half an hour in winter and leave someone strangely tired afterward. Energy was precious, and winter drained it slowly, like a leak no one could fix. Clothing stayed on almost constantly. Many peasants owned only one main set of clothes, maybe a second if they were fortunate. Changing outfits was a luxury. Clothes absorbed smoke, sweat, and dampness until they felt heavy and smelled strongly of daily life. Taking them off meant getting cold, so people kept them on, even while sleeping. Feet suffered the most. Shoes were thin leather with little protection from snow or frozen ground. Water soaked through easily. Toes went numb. Frost nip turned into frostbite without much warning. People often noticed only when feeling didn't come back. Villages adapted in subtle ways. Winter slowed expectations. If someone moved more slowly, that was understood. If someone stayed inside more often, no one judged. Survival became a shared project. Food sharing happened quietly, without announcements. A neighbor might leave a bit of grain. Someone else might offer a bowl of stew. There were limits, of course. No one could help if they had nothing themselves. Winter forced careful calculations not just of resources, but of generosity. There were small winter celebrations, but they were modest. Christmas for peasants wasn't a feast of endless dishes. It was a slightly better meal than usual. Fresh bread, if flour allowed, a bit of meat, some ale. Enough to mark the day and remind everyone that joy still existed somewhere, even if it was currently bundled up and shivering. Alcohol mattered in winter. Ale and small beer were safer than water and provided calories. People drank regularly, not necessarily to excess, but as part of daily life. It dulled hunger, it warmed the body, it made sleep come more easily in cold rooms. Time itself felt different in winter. Without long daylight hours, days blurred together. There were fewer visual changes in the landscape.
Fields were empty, trees were bare, everything existed in shades of gray, white, and brown. People measured time by church bells, by meals, by the slow shrinking of firewood piles. Nights stretched endlessly. Darkness arrived early and stayed late, and boredom became a quiet companion. This was the season of stories. Oral tradition thrived in winter because there was little else to do. Old legends were repeated, saints' lives were retold, local ghost stories were shared softly, not to scare anyone too much, just to give shape to the long hours. Silence in winter could feel heavy, like something pressing down from above, and stories helped keep it at bay. Fear was too, but it was a muted fear. Fear of running out of food before spring, fear that a cough would turn into something worse, fear that the thaw would come too late. Spring was never guaranteed. Peasants watched the weather obsessively. A slightly warmer day felt hopeful. A late frost felt personal, like an insult from the sky. By late winter, stores were at their lowest. This period, sometimes called the hunger gap, was the hardest. Meals grew smaller. Energy vanished. People sometimes ate seed grain, fully aware that it would cause problems later, but winter encouraged short-term thinking. Survival today mattered more than planting tomorrow. Mental strain built quietly. In modern terms, many peasants experienced what we would call depression. They described it as heaviness, as weariness of spirit. Church attendance increased not just from devotion, but from needing to be around other people. Winter isolated households physically, and church pulled them back together for a few hours each week. It reminded people that they weren't enduring this alone. Deaths still happened, often without drama. Elders sometimes simply didn't wake up. Children weakened gradually and slipped away. Frozen ground made burials difficult. Graves were hard to dig, and sometimes bodies waited. Grief didn't disappear, but it was compressed. There wasn't time or energy to dwell on it. Winter demanded emotional efficiency. As the weeks dragged on, patience wore thin. Small arguments flared more easily. Everyone was tired of everyone else. Cabin fever existed long before cabins were cozy and charming. But peasants were practiced at endurance. They had survived winters before. Each one made the next feel survivable, if not pleasant. And then, slowly, almost without anyone noticing at first, things began to change. Days grew a little longer. Snow softened instead of crunching. Water dripped from roofs. Mud returned, which was unpleasant but familiar. The first signs of spring weren't beautiful. They were messy, wet, and cold in a different way. But they meant survival. They meant winter, once again, had been endured.
By the time winter began to loosen its grip, no one celebrated right away. Medieval peasants had learned not to trust early warmth. A few mild days didn't mean anything. Winter liked to fake its own ending and then come back angry. So when the snow softened and the air felt less sharp, people noticed, but they didn't comment much. Hope was handled carefully, like something fragile that could break if spoken aloud. The first real change was light. Days stretched just enough to be noticed. Morning arrived a little earlier. Evening held on a little longer. This alone lifted spirits more than any sermon ever could. Sunlight, even weak winter sunlight, reminded people that the world still existed beyond their smoky rooms. It crept into houses through small openings, touching walls and floors that hadn't seen much brightness in months. Physically, bodies were in rough shape. Winter left its mark quietly. People emerged thinner, joints stiff, skin cracked and raw from cold air and constant dampness. Old injuries still ached. New ones had healed poorly. Everyone moved carefully at first, like they were testing their own limbs to see what still worked. There was no sudden burst of energy. Recovery was slow. Strength came back gradually, fueled by slightly larger meals and the psychological relief of knowing the worst was probably over.
Food improved incrementally. This wasn't a dramatic feast. It was small changes, a little more grain, a few preserved vegetables pulled from storage. Eventually, the first fresh greens appeared. These were often humble things, nettles, wild onions, early herbs, but they mattered. Freshness itself felt medicinal. People believed spring greens cleansed the body of winter's heaviness, and honestly, they weren't wrong. After months of starch and salt, anything green felt like a gift. Work resumed before anyone felt ready. Fields needed attention as soon as the ground softened enough to be worked. Plowing began, slow and difficult after months of inactivity. Animals, thin from winter fodder, struggled at first. Everyone was behind. Winter always left people behind, but there was no catching up later. The agricultural calendar waited for no one. Villages grew louder. Doors stayed open longer. People lingered outside despite the chill. Conversations stretched. After months of near isolation, even small talk felt welcome. Disputes that had simmered through winter sometimes resurfaced, but many were set aside. Survival had required cooperation, and that momentum often carried into spring. Churches marked the change. Easter was not just a religious event, but a seasonal one. It symbolized survival. People arrived tired but relieved. Clothes were the same, patched and worn, but faces looked more animated. Bells sounded brighter somehow, or maybe people were just better at hearing them now that the world felt less closed in. Winter sickness existed too. Bodies weakened by winter were vulnerable. Colds lingered, fevers came and went. But there was movement now. Air, light. Illness felt less suffocating. The sense of being trapped indoors faded. Psychologically, spring reset something deep. Winter had narrowed life down to essentials: food, warmth, endurance. Spring allowed thoughts to expand again. People planned. They worried about harvests instead of survival. They argued about land boundaries. They discussed marriages and deaths. Ordinary concerns returned, which was a sign of health. Yet winter was never forgotten. It lingered in habits. People continued to ration instinctively, even when stores improved. Firewood was still treated carefully. Extra food was salted or dried whenever possible. Memory of hunger didn't fade quickly. Every peasant knew another winter would come, and preparation began almost immediately, even as the fields were being planted. Children changed in spring. Those who had survived winter grew rapidly, as if making up for lost time. Those who hadn't were quietly remembered and then absorbed into the village memory. Loss was acknowledged, but life pressed forward. Medieval peasants couldn't afford prolonged mourning. Survival demanded attention. As spring turned toward early summer, the landscape transformed fully. Green returned aggressively, fields filled with work and noise. Winter felt distant, almost unreal, like a bad dream that faded with daylight, but it was never truly gone. It lived in the way people worked quickly, in the way they saved scraps, in the way they eyed the sky a little too often. Winter shaped them. It always did. By early summer, winter felt distant enough that people could almost pretend it hadn't happened. Almost. The fields were busy again, full of movement and noise. Tools rang against soil. Animals grazed more freely. The sun lingered in the sky long enough to feel generous. But winter never truly disappeared from a peasant's mind. It stayed there quietly, shaping decisions, habits, and expectations long after the frost was gone. Every action in summer carried a shadow of the coming cold. Firewood gathering resumed early, sometimes as soon as the ground dried enough to move carts into the forest. No one waited until autumn if they could help it. Wood cut in summer dried better, burned hotter, and lasted longer. Peasants knew this from experience, not theory. Each log stacked neatly near a house was a small promise to the future, a way of telling winter, not this time. Food preservation became a constant background task. Excess milk was turned into cheese, surplus vegetables were dried or salted. Meat, when available, was preserved carefully. There was no moment when someone said, "Now we prepare for winter." Preparation simply never stopped. Summer abundance was temporary, and everyone knew it. The memory of thin meals and empty stores was still fresh enough to hurt. Even clothing was handled with winter in mind. Wool was repaired and re-repaired. Tears were patched. Garments were reshaped to fit growing children rather than replaced entirely. New clothes were rare, and old ones were valued not for their appearance, but for how well they blocked wind. Summer warmth was used to air out fabrics that had absorbed months of smoke and dampness. Clothes were beaten, brushed, and hung in sunlight, as if trying to shake winter out of them. Health improved in warmer months, but not completely. Winter left lingering effects. Joints ached permanently after years of cold labor. Lungs damaged by smoke and damp air never fully recovered. Older peasants carried winter inside their bodies, feeling it in every chill breeze. When summer storms rolled in and temperatures dropped suddenly, people noticed. The body remembered. Emotionally, people were cautious. They enjoyed summer, but without recklessness. Festivals happened, but they were modest. Laughter existed, but it didn't erase the underlying awareness that comfort was temporary. This wasn't pessimism so much as realism. Medieval peasants had learned, over generations, not to trust good weather too much. Children born in summer were treated with particular care. Parents knew their first winter would be a test. Extra attention was given to keeping them fed and warm. Babies were swaddled tightly, even in warm months, partly out of tradition and partly out of fear. Winter had taught parents how fragile survival really was. Stories told in summer still referenced winter. Tales of hardship, endurance, and loss were passed down not to frighten children, but to teach them. Winter was the ultimate teacher in medieval life. It taught restraint. It taught cooperation. It taught people exactly how little they needed to survive and how much they depended on each other. Communal bonds forged during winter carried forward. People who had shared food or helped during the hungry months were remembered. Reputation mattered. A family known for generosity during winter gained social standing that no title could provide. Likewise, those who had refused help or hoarded excessively were quietly noted. Memory in small villages was long. As summer matured, attention shifted toward the harvest. Anxiety crept back in. Weather was watched closely. Too much rain could ruin crops. Too little could stunt them. A bad harvest meant a hard winter, and everyone understood the math. The coming cold was already being calculated in the height of wheat and the fullness of grain heads. By late summer, early signs of autumn appeared. Nights cooled slightly. Morning dew lingered. These changes were subtle, but peasants noticed them immediately. The cycle was turning again. No one panicked. Panic didn't help, but there was a quiet tightening of focus. Work intensified. Repairs were finished. Storage areas were checked and rechecked. Winter, in the medieval peasant's mind, was not a surprise. It was an appointment, an unavoidable one. And as we continue drifting forward, we'll look at how repeated winters shaped peasant culture itself, how songs, beliefs, and traditions formed around the cold, and how endurance became something almost sacred. Because surviving winter wasn't just practical, it was cultural. It defined who these people were, year after year, generation after generation. Over time, winter stopped being just a season and became something closer to a shared memory that everyone carried, whether they talked about it or not. Medieval peasant culture was shaped by cold in quiet, persistent ways. Songs, sayings, habits, and beliefs all bent around the expectation of hardship. Winter wasn't dramatic or heroic, it was ordinary, and that made it powerful. Folk sayings about winter were everywhere. They warned against waste, praised patience, and reminded people that comfort was temporary. These weren't poetic flourishes, they were survival notes passed down orally. Parents repeated them to children the way we might repeat safety rules, because ignoring them could have consequences. Winter had no sympathy for optimism unsupported by preparation. Religious belief absorbed winter easily. Sermons leaned heavily on endurance, humility, and suffering with grace. Cold and hunger were framed as tests, not punishments. This mattered psychologically. It gave hardship meaning. If winter was part of a divine plan, then surviving it wasn't just luck, it was virtue. People who endured quietly were admired more than those who complained loudly. Saints associated with endurance, healing, or protection from cold gained particular importance in rural communities. Candles were lit carefully, prayers whispered in low voices. No one expected miracles exactly. What they hoped for was balance. A winter that was hard but not devastating. A harvest that was enough. Enough was always the goal. Winter also shaped humor. Peasant humor was dry, understated, and often self-deprecating. Jokes about cold, hunger, and bad luck circulated quietly, not to make light of suffering, but to normalize it. Laughing softly at shared misery made it feel manageable. Humor didn't deny reality, it sat beside it. Social rules adjusted for winter realities. Expectations around productivity softened. A man who worked slower in winter wasn't lazy, he was cold. A woman who stayed inside more often wasn't antisocial, she was conserving warmth. Children were given more leniency. Winter demanded energy conservation, and communities understood that intuitively. Marriage and family planning were influenced by the seasons. Weddings often took place after harvest, before winter fully set in, when food was more abundant. Pregnancies that reached late stages in winter were particularly risky, and everyone knew it. Births in spring were considered fortunate. Timing mattered in ways modern life rarely considers. Memory played a powerful role. Every particularly harsh winter became a reference point. Worse than the winter of was a phrase that carried weight. These winters were remembered collectively, spoken of for decades. They shaped behavior long after they passed. A single disastrous season could make a village more cautious for a generation. Children absorbed these memories early. They learned to read signs of weather not from books, but from watching adults. The way voices changed when clouds gathered, the way people hurried to finish tasks before frost. Winter awareness was taught without formal instruction. It was simply part of growing up. Even leisure reflected endurance. Games were simple, music was repetitive and soothing. There was comfort in familiarity. Winter taught people not to crave novelty. Predictability was safety. Familiar routines meant fewer surprises, and surprises in winter were rarely good. As years passed, individuals aged alongside winters. Each season added to their personal archive of endurance. Older peasants didn't boast about surviving winters. They didn't need to. Their bodies showed it. Bent backs, weathered faces, slow movements. These weren't signs of weakness. They were records of survival. When death came, winter or otherwise, it wasn't usually framed as tragedy alone. It was understood as part of the cycle. Someone had endured as long as they could. That was enough. Grief existed, but it coexisted with acceptance. Winter taught people how to let go without unraveling. And still, despite everything, people found moments of warmth. A well-tended fire, a shared meal, a story told for the 100th time. Winter sharpened appreciation for small comforts. It trained attention on what truly mattered.
What medieval peasants passed down most reliably wasn't wealth, because there wasn't much of that to pass. It wasn't land either, because land could be lost, divided, or taken. What survived most consistently was knowledge, quiet, practical knowledge shaped by winter and refined through repetition. It moved from one generation to the next without books or formal lessons, carried instead through habit, observation, and gentle correction. Children learned winter preparation by watching. They learned which trees burned best by seeing which logs adults chose without discussion. They learned how much grain could be spared by observing how carefully it was measured. No one explained these things outright. Explanation wasn't necessary. Winter made the lesson clear every year. If you misjudged, you felt it in your bones. This knowledge was local. What worked in one village might fail in another. Wind patterns, soil types, access to forests and water sources all mattered. Peasants knew their landscape intimately because their survival depended on it. A sheltered slope could mean warmer ground. A nearby stand of trees could mean extra firewood. These details were memorized over lifetimes and shared selectively, usually within families. Cooking knowledge followed the same pattern. There were no written recipes. People knew how long to boil grain, how to stretch fat across meals, how to make something filling out of almost nothing. Winter sharpened these skills. A mistake in summer was inconvenient. A mistake in winter was costly. Over time, households developed routines that minimized risk. Meals were predictable, not because people lacked imagination, but because predictability worked. Medical knowledge was similarly practical. People knew which herbs eased coughs, which poultices reduced swelling, which teas helped sleep come easier on cold nights. None of this was guaranteed to work, but it worked often enough to be remembered. Winter made experimentation cautious. You didn't try new remedies casually when energy and health were already stretched thin. Shelter knowledge mattered deeply. Small adjustments to houses accumulated over generations. A door hung slightly lower, a wall thickened, a draft blocked with rags or straw. These weren't renovations, they were refinements. Each winter revealed weaknesses. Each spring offered a chance to fix them. Houses became layered records of past cold. Even social knowledge was passed down. People learned who could be relied on in hard times. Families built reputations across generations. A household known for helping others in winter was remembered. So was one known for hoarding. These reputations influenced marriages, alliances, and support networks. Winter didn't just test individuals, it tested communities. Storytelling carried lessons too. Tales of especially harsh winters were retold not for drama, but for instruction. They contained warnings about overconfidence, about ignoring signs, about delaying preparation. Children listened without fully understanding, but the stories stayed with them. Years later, those same stories surfaced when decisions needed to be made quickly. This passing of knowledge created continuity. Even as individual peasants lived short, difficult lives, the village as a whole became more resilient. Each generation started where the last one ended. Winter knowledge accumulated slowly, like sediment.
It didn't eliminate suffering, but it reduced surprise. And in a medieval winter, fewer surprises meant better odds. There was also acceptance woven into this knowledge. Not everything could be controlled. Sometimes the weather defeated preparation. Sometimes illness spread despite care. Winter taught people the limits of effort. Knowing when to endure and when to let go was part of survival too. As people aged, they became living references. Elders were consulted not because they were powerful, but because they had seen more winters. Their memories carried weight. When an older villager warned of a hard season coming, others listened. Experience was authority. By the end of a lifetime, a peasant had survived dozens of winters. Each one left its mark, but each one also added to the quiet archive of knowledge that would outlast them. When they died, something more than a person was lost. A small library of experience faded with them. That was understood, and it was mourned in its own way. And as we drift toward the final stretch, we'll step back and look at the full picture, not to romanticize it and not to judge it, but to understand what it meant to endure winter not once, but repeatedly as a way of life. Because medieval peasants didn't survive winter by conquering it, they survived by adapting, remembering, and continuing, even when comfort was never guaranteed.
As the years passed, winter and its rhythms became the scaffolding of daily life. Medieval peasants relied on routine more than luck or inspiration. Each day had a purpose, whether the ground was frozen solid or thawing slowly. Even small, repetitive tasks carried significance. Chopping wood, checking grain stores, tending animals, these actions were almost meditative, a way to assert some control over a world that offered very little. The repetition of winter work, exhausting as it was, provided structure. It gave the day shape. And in a life marked by scarcity, structure mattered as much as food or warmth. Routine also shaped perception of time. Without modern clocks, daylight and church bells became the markers of hours, and seasons measured life in broader strokes. Winter stretched into what felt like an endless expanse of darkness, and only through consistent daily action did peasants keep track of existence. Even leisure followed this cadence. Simple games, weaving, or storytelling were interspersed between essential chores, offering a gentle relief without disrupting survival. Each movement, each small decision was calibrated to endure the cold, to protect health, and to preserve energy. Community routines were equally vital. Villages acted in unspoken coordination, particularly in winter. Work parties gathered to chop wood or repair roofs. Neighbors helped each other haul water from frozen wells. Shared efforts were not dramatic, but quietly indispensable. A village that understood rhythm survived better. Emergencies were rare because preparation and collaboration had already done most of the work. Mutual dependence was a survival strategy as much as it was a social bond, and winter intensified the importance of every small act of cooperation. Even the timing of labor reflected the rhythm of endurance. Fields lay fallow in the coldest months, but preparation for planting began as soon as the thaw allowed. People didn't rush, because rushing wasted energy and risked mistakes. Instead, work moved forward steadily, deliberately, like a metronome keeping pace with necessity. Nothing about this life was sudden or dramatic. Survival itself was the slowest and most persistent story ever told. One repetition after another,
winter after winter. Food habits were embedded in routine, too. Meals were predictable. Gruel in the morning, a simple stew for dinner, perhaps bread and cheese in between. There was little room for extravagance, and repetition was comforting in its own way. Peasants didn't hunger for variety, they hungered for consistency. When winter ended and fresh food returned, it was treated with cautious appreciation rather than reckless indulgence. Scarcity trained them to savor sustenance without expecting abundance. Children learned patience and endurance as naturally as they learned to walk. Play often took place indoors, quiet and careful, so as not to expend too much energy. Lessons were subtle. Watch the adults, imitate their methods, notice what is valued, and remember it. Mistakes were instructive, but winter made the consequences real. Survival reinforced learning more effectively than any teacher could. By the time children were teenagers, they understood cold, hunger, and preparation intimately. Winter also shaped emotional life in quiet ways. Despair was real, but so was resilience. Living with constant, predictable hardship forged a temperament that was patient, watchful, and practical. Outbursts of anger or fear were tempered by necessity. Complaining too much risked wasting energy better used for tasks that mattered. Over generations, this emotional adaptation became cultural. Calm persistence was admired, not heroics. The small victories of daily survival counted far more than any dramatic success. Even celebrations followed careful rhythm. Holidays, festivals, and religious observances offered relief from monotony, but never excess. These moments were brief pauses, designed to lift spirits without jeopardizing resources. Winter had taught moderation, and that lesson carried into every aspect of life. Joy existed, but it was measured, it was quiet, it was sustainable. Ultimately, medieval peasants were defined by endurance. Their culture, habits, and even humor revolved around the slow accumulation of small victories. They didn't confront winter like a battle to be won. They adapted to it, negotiated with it, and learned to move alongside it. Each season left its mark on body, mind, and community. Over time, survival became second nature, and life became a continuous, measured dance with cold, darkness, and scarcity. Winter didn't just shape work and routine, it shaped the way people related to each other. Living in close quarters for months on end created bonds that were quiet but resilient. Families clustered together near the fire, sharing warmth, food, and stories. Privacy was a luxury rarely afforded, and intimacy came less from romance than from mutual dependence. Parents, children, siblings, and extended kin learned each other's rhythms, the subtle cues that indicated illness, hunger, or fatigue. These small attentions mattered. They were survival strategies dressed as care. When someone faltered, others noticed immediately, often correcting the problem before it became critical. Relationships were practical, yes, but they were also deeply human, formed in the quiet, repetitive reality of enduring cold. Marriage and partnerships were also filtered through the lens of winter. Choosing a spouse wasn't just about affection or social advantage, it was about endurance. Could a potential partner manage cold and hunger? Could they rise early, carry wood, tend animals, and keep children alive during months of deprivation? The traits that mattered most were rarely romantic, they were functional. Patience, resilience, and reliability mattered far more than beauty or charm. In some ways, cold sharpened social judgment. Those who failed to endure winter effectively were less desirable partners because failure was contagious in a world where survival depended on cooperation. Friendship and neighborly bonds were equally shaped by necessity. Villagers exchanged small services, mending a roof, helping with milking, sharing food. These acts weren't done for recognition, they were quietly understood as essential. You didn't help a neighbor because you wanted thanks, you helped because if you didn't, the ripple effect could endanger everyone. Communities built on mutual assistance were more resilient. Villages remembered who could be counted on and who couldn't. Winter left marks not just on bodies but on reputations. Conflict in winter was subtle. With so much pressure, arguments could flare, but they were often tempered by survival instinct. There wasn't room for prolonged feuds. A fight over property or livestock might be postponed until spring, when energy returned. Resentment simmered quietly, but people learned to coexist because shared hardship demanded it. In this sense, winter imposed a kind of social discipline. It taught moderation, patience, and a focus on what truly mattered: survival, community, and routine. Even religious life intertwined with social bonds and winter survival. Church services were a place to gather, share information, and maintain connections. Attendance fluctuated depending on weather and health, but the ritual itself reinforced communal cohesion. Prayers for warmth, for health, for harvest success weren't only spiritual. They were subtle reminders of interdependence. Faith provided structure and psychological relief, especially when physical realities were relentlessly harsh. Saints and holy figures associated with endurance or protection were quietly revered because they represented hope and continuity. Children's relationships were similarly shaped by necessity and proximity. They learned to cooperate early, to share, to observe adult behavior closely. Games often mimicked adult labor, preparing them mentally and physically for what lay ahead. Play reinforced social skills, endurance, and patience. Even in childhood, survival was a communal lesson disguised as fun. The harsh environment left little room for selfishness. Children absorbed cultural memory: which plants were safe, how to care for animals, how to ration, how to read subtle signs of impending cold or illness. Relationships, in every sense, were built to last through the hardship of winter. Finally, emotional bonds deepened quietly. The shared experience of cold and scarcity created empathy. People learned to recognize exhaustion, hunger, and illness in others and respond without being prompted. This was social knowledge as survival strategy. By enduring together, villagers created an unspoken understanding. No one survives alone. Winter demanded it. Endurance, cooperation, and quiet attention became cultural norms. Strength wasn't measured in heroics, but in consistency, reliability, and the ability to move through months of hardship without losing one's place in the community.
By the time a peasant reached adulthood, winter had already left its fingerprints across every aspect of life, not just on the body, which was bent and stiff from cold labor, nor on the health, which was constantly under siege by damp, smoke-filled air and inadequate nutrition. Winter also left its mark on thought, habit, and culture. It taught lessons that no book could provide, lessons that were absorbed quietly, slowly, often without conscious awareness. These lessons weren't dramatic, they weren't heroic, they were practical, subtle and pervasive. And they shaped generations, creating a cultural framework that persisted long after the last frost melted from the ground. Winter taught patience. This wasn't the abstract patience of modern self-help manuals. It was grounded, functional patience. The ability to wait for firewood to dry before burning it, the skill to stretch a limited supply of grain over days, the discipline to remain still and conserve energy during particularly harsh nights. There was no room for impulsive action. Mistakes were physically costly and sometimes deadly. Children observed adults carefully and internalized these patterns early. They learned that rushing through tasks didn't just make mistakes, it could make survival impossible. The monotony of winter reinforced this lesson continuously. Every day offered the same limited set of choices, and every choice had consequences, slowly etched into memory. Observation was another skill honed by repeated winters. Peasants became hyper-aware of the signs of impending weather. Frost appearing on the leaves of early shrubs, the way the wind shifted through the trees, the behavior of animals, all of these were signals to which they paid attention, often unconsciously. Children were taught to notice, not through formal instruction, but through imitation. Winter created a culture of careful observation, where small details carried immense significance. Over time, entire communities developed shared weather intelligence, the kind that only emerges when survival depends on noticing the quietest cues from the natural world. Winter also shaped concepts of risk. In a modern context, risk is abstract and often financial. For medieval peasants, risk was tangible, immediate, and measured in days and calories. People learned which activities were too dangerous in certain conditions, climbing icy roofs, fetching water from frozen streams, or traveling even short distances across slippery fields. They learned which compromises were acceptable, stretching meals, delaying chores, or cutting work short, and which were not. These lessons were embedded in routine. Risk management became a cultural norm, a way of thinking that underpinned everything from work habits to social interactions. Food culture was profoundly influenced by winter. Meals were repetitive and functional, but that repetition carried its own kind of rhythm. People didn't snack mindlessly. Each morsel was consumed with awareness, and every meal was rationed according to necessity. There was little room for indulgence, and yet the scarcity sharpened appreciation for small pleasures. A fresh turnip after months of dried vegetables, or a sip of ale that was warmer than usual, became a minor celebration. Summer abundance was treated with the same measured attention as winter scarcity, because peasants knew that all abundance was temporary. Over time, these experiences created a cultural memory in which food was valued not for taste alone, but for its role in survival. Sharing food also became a ritual of social cohesion. Every act of generosity, every borrowed loaf, every cup of ale given to a neighbor reinforced communal bonds and created a network of subtle obligations and trust. Labor was dictated by seasonal patterns, and winter taught people how to allocate effort wisely. Work during the cold months was slow and deliberate. Even small tasks, tending to animals, checking firewood, repairing clothing, required careful attention. Mistakes could be physically costly. Summer, by contrast, offered opportunity for broader productivity. The labor of planting and harvesting relied on the body's endurance built over winter months. Winter created an implicit understanding of pacing. You expend energy carefully when it is scarce, and you push harder when conditions are more forgiving. This pacing became cultural wisdom, passed from parent to child, reinforced by the slow rhythms of rural life. Winter also embedded notions of responsibility into social structures. Survival depended on collective effort, and everyone's contribution mattered. Adults supervised children not out of arbitrary authority, but because failure had immediate consequences. Siblings and extended kin cooperated naturally because the household depended on coordination. Neighbors assisted one another not out of charity, but out of necessity. Reputation was shaped by winter conduct. Those who consistently contributed to collective survival earned trust and social capital. Those who shirked, even subtly, were remembered, and their reliability in future seasons was questioned. Social cohesion became a practical, enforced norm, and winter was the teacher that made it inevitable. Storytelling, songs, and oral traditions were likewise shaped by repeated cold months. Stories served multiple purposes. They entertained, they instructed, and they preserved communal memory. Legends of past winters, particularly harsh years, miraculous survivals, or notable tragedies, were recounted with detail and care. These tales weren't embellished for excitement. Exaggeration would have been counterproductive. Accuracy mattered. Children learned through these stories which hazards to anticipate, which strategies were effective, and which behaviors were socially acceptable. Repetition reinforced memory, and the cumulative knowledge of generations was preserved not on parchment, but in words, gestures, and patterns of living. Religious observance also intertwined seamlessly with winter survival. Saints associated with endurance, protection, or healing were quietly revered in ways that had practical significance. Daily prayers, rituals, and communal services created psychological frameworks that sustained people through months of hardship. Faith wasn't only spiritual consolation, it was a form of social glue, reinforcing norms of care, patience, and shared responsibility. The church was both moral and practical institution. It structured the week, marked time, and provided occasions for gathering, passing information, and reaffirming communal bonds. Winter, in this sense, was both a physical challenge and a cultural organizer. Even humor, subtle as it was, reflected winter's influence. Peasant humor tended to be dry, understated, often self-deprecating. Jokes about frostbite, frozen meals, or clumsy handling of firewood circulated quietly. Humor wasn't a means of escape, it was a coping mechanism. Shared laughter strengthened social bonds and diffused tension in close quarters. Winter created conditions in which empathy, observation, and gentle mockery were essential social tools. Humor reinforced community by acknowledging hardship collectively rather than individually. Winter also enforced resilience in ways that shaped psychology. The relentless, monotonous cold and scarcity honed patience and stoicism. Emotional discipline became necessary. Excessive panic, anger, or despair consumed energy that could otherwise be spent on work or survival. People learned to moderate their responses, to hold back frustration, and to prioritize persistence over impulse. Over generations, these traits became cultural norms. Communities valued consistent, reliable behavior more than dramatic action. Heroism existed quietly in everyday survival rather than in stories of battles or political triumphs. Education, in its practical form, was winter-shaped as well. Knowledge was transmitted through observation, imitation, and repetition. Children watched adults prepare meals, tend animals, and repair homes. They learned which plants were safe to eat, how to read subtle environmental cues, and how to ration resources. Mistakes were instructive, often in ways that left no room for repetition. Winter sharpened experiential learning, and these lessons carried forward without formal instruction. Each generation inherited not just property or land, but a deep repository of survival knowledge. The memory of winter extended beyond survival into moral and ethical dimensions.
Sharing, cooperation, patience, and foresight were not abstract virtues, they were directly linked to life and death. Ethical behavior and practical survival were inextricable. Those who hoarded, neglected communal duties, or ignored the needs of others risked not only social censure, but practical consequences for the community and themselves. In this way, morality and culture were entwined with environment. Winter codified social ethics through lived experience. By the time summer fully arrived and green returned to fields, winter's influence persisted. People carried its lessons in every action, from how they mended clothing to how they rationed food, how they raised children, and how they measured trust. It was subtle but constant, a pervasive framework that shaped thought, behavior, and relationships. Even when warmth returned, it was never assumed to be permanent. Every peasant knew another cold season would come. Preparation and endurance were continuous processes, not one-off efforts. Ultimately, medieval peasants lived with winter not as a distant threat, but as an integral force shaping daily life, culture, and community. Endurance became more than a survival tactic, it became a defining.
As winter settled into the village year after year, it did more than shape daily life. It reinforced hierarchy and tradition in subtle, almost invisible ways. The social order was never written into the snow, of course, but it was embedded in the rhythms of survival. Elders, because they had lived through more winters, naturally commanded respect. They were repositories of knowledge, advisors in subtle matters of rationing, timing, and preparation. Younger adults deferred to their experience, not out of fear, but out of practicality. When harsh cold arrived, it was obvious who had seen it all before, who understood its dangers, and whose guidance might make the difference between surviving and faltering. In this way, winter quietly reaffirmed social hierarchies. Experience was authority, and time and cold counted as merit. Wealth and status, while always present in peasant life, were measured differently in winter. Those who had larger reserves of food or better clothing weren't just fortunate, they were safer. Yet hoarding was socially visible and culturally risky. A family known for selfishness during the cold months could find itself socially isolated, even if it had the most stores. Conversely, a modest household that shared what little it had gained subtle prestige and trust. Winter turned generosity into a currency more valuable than silver. It reinforced moral norms not through laws or punishments, but through practical consequences and communal memory. Social cohesion and reputation became matters of survival, and every household's standing was tested quietly each year. Tradition itself was enforced by the cold. Rituals surrounding preparation, sustenance, and even movement through the village became ingrained over generations. The timing of chores, the ways to store grain, the paths to take through snowdrifts, all were traditional knowledge, passed down orally and through repetition. Children absorbed these patterns without formal instruction. They learned the acceptable ways of conducting life during harsh months, and deviations were noticed immediately, corrected subtly, and eventually absorbed into the rhythm of the community. Winter, in this sense, acted as a natural regulator, reinforcing the practices that had been proven effective by years of experience. Superstition and belief were never far from everyday life, and winter intensified both. Long nights and scarce light created spaces where imagination drifted freely. Shadows in doorways, strange sounds from frozen rivers, or the groaning of snow-laden roofs were quietly noted and woven into stories of spirits, protective saints, or local omens. While fear was rarely overtly paralyzing, it was a constant undercurrent, and it shaped behavior. People avoided taking unnecessary risks, kept fires tended, and watched children carefully, all under the shadow of these subtle beliefs.
Religion and superstition were functional tools as much as they were sources of comfort, blending seamlessly with practical survival strategies. Even death and mourning were framed by winter's lessons. Cold months left bodies more vulnerable, and harsh seasons sometimes claimed the very young and very old. Funerals were practical affairs, conducted quickly to prevent illness or exposure. Emotional grief was compressed, shaped by necessity. Communities learned to grieve in ways that didn't jeopardize collective endurance. The lessons of winter, patience, moderation, foresight, extended into mourning practices. Long lamentations or extravagant ceremonies were rare because they consumed resources and energy that might be needed immediately elsewhere. In this way, winter not only shaped life, but also guided the rituals surrounding its end. Marriage and family life were subtly influenced by seasonal cycles. Courtship and unions were often timed to avoid winter's harshest months. Families considered more than affection or property when arranging marriages. They considered resilience, ability to endure, and practical skill. A potential spouse's reputation during prior winters mattered. Could they manage food, tend animals, care for children, and maintain the household? These questions were often unspoken but understood universally. Endurance and reliability became valued traits, as important as beauty, charm, or wealth. Children born in spring, after the harshest months, were considered fortunate, having survived the period of greatest risk in early life. Work, labor, and leisure remained carefully balanced by the memory of winter. Even during the warm months, people never forgot the rigor of cold. Routines established in winter carried into summer, shaping pacing, effort, and cooperation. Leisure was subdued. Storytelling, music, and games provided relief but rarely indulgence. Activities followed predictable rhythms, minimizing risk and preserving energy. Celebration existed, but it was always measured, never excessive. Even festivals carried practical overtones, preparation for the next season, reinforcing social bonds, and teaching younger generations the continuity of survival knowledge. Cultural identity, in fact, was inseparable from winter. Villages defined themselves through their collective ability to endure the long, harsh months. Stories of past winters, songs, sayings, and rituals built communal memory. Each household contributed to a shared archive of knowledge, practices, and moral lessons. Every winter that passed reinforced these norms and strengthened social cohesion. Individual survival was necessary but insufficient. The village as a whole needed to function as a cohesive unit. Winter demanded cooperation, and through repeated seasons, cooperation became cultural, internalized, and expected. Even the small, quiet acts of daily life carried weight. Checking on an elderly neighbor, sharing the last ration of grain, tending a sick child, repairing clothing or tools, all these acts, repeated over months and years, constituted the ethical and cultural backbone of the community. The cold pressed necessity into morality. Survival wasn't only a physical act, it was social, ethical, and emotional. Those who succeeded were not necessarily stronger or braver in dramatic ways. They were careful, patient, observant, and consistent. These traits were refined in winter and celebrated quietly in daily life. Children growing up in these cycles internalized winter as a teacher of life's broader lessons. They learned resource management, emotional restraint, and cooperation without formal instruction. They absorbed cultural norms through imitation, observation, and participation in community routines. Mistakes were instructive but rarely catastrophic because collective care mitigated them. Over time, these lessons accumulated across generations. Winter, harsh and monotonous, became the invisible curriculum that structured thought, behavior, and expectations. Even storytelling once again served practical functions. Tales of previous winters, sometimes tragic, sometimes miraculous, preserved knowledge across decades. These stories reinforced norms, which behaviors ensured survival, which decisions carried consequences, which members of the community could be relied upon and which could not. Oral tradition was the backbone of education, the repository of cultural memory, and the slow teacher of generations. Repetition ensured that no child grew up ignorant of the risks, methods, and expectations embedded in seasonal life. Finally, the psychological impact of repeated winters cannot be overstated. Patience, stoicism, and measured emotional responses became hallmarks of personality. People learned to conserve energy in thought as well as body. Complaints were kept quiet, humor remained dry and subtle, and the ability to persevere without outward dramatics was admired. Heroism was internalized. Bravery was quiet, incremental, and practical, rather than grandiose or performative. A peasant's life was defined not by dramatic victories, but by decades of repeated, careful endurance, punctuated by minor joys and measured celebrations.
As spring fully arrived and summer followed, the memory of winter remained alive in every aspect of peasant life. No one forgot the months of cold, damp, and scarcity. They were too deeply ingrained, too persistent to leave entirely. Even in warmth, routines established in winter endured. Houses were maintained with care. Firewood was stacked thoughtfully. Grain was rationed and stored, not out of immediate necessity, but in recognition that scarcity could return at any moment. The lessons of winter, reinforced year after year, were not temporary adjustments, they were permanent frameworks for living. Every peasant carried these lessons in body, mind, and habit. Survival had been achieved, but it was never assumed, it was always prepared for. Life became a delicate balance between abundance and scarcity, ease and effort. Summer provided respite, yet people moved cautiously, never fully abandoning the vigilance winter had taught. Every decision, what to eat, how much to labor, when to rest, whom to trust, was shaped by months of previous cold. Winter had trained judgment in subtle ways. Choices were guided by a blend of observation, experience, and communal memory. Impulsiveness was dangerous. Thoughtfulness was survival. Even celebrations were tempered. Festivals offered relief from monotony, but never indulgence. Each moment of joy was framed by the understanding that comfort was transient and that endurance was permanent. Children, now older, carried the rhythm of winter into daily life without needing reminders. Their play, chores, and social interactions were influenced by repeated cycles of cold and scarcity. They knew, instinctively, which tasks were urgent, which could be delayed, and which required careful observation. Mistakes had consequences, yes, but the community's collective knowledge buffered the impact. Learning was continuous, experiential, and woven seamlessly into life. Winter had provided the curriculum, and generations internalized it with quiet diligence. By adulthood, these lessons were second nature. Survival, cooperation, patience, and reliability had become part of identity, shaping behavior, relationships, and reputation. The psychological impact of repeated winters cannot be understated. Months of darkness, cold, and monotony fostered resilience, patience, and stoicism. People learned to conserve not just physical energy, but emotional and cognitive resources. Complaints were muted. Humor remained understated, often dry and self-deprecating, a subtle way to acknowledge hardship without wasting strength. Perseverance was quiet, internalized, and cumulative. Bravery was measured by consistency, endurance, and reliability rather than grandiose feats. Each season, each challenge reinforced these traits, gradually shaping a culture in which survival was inseparable from temperament. Social bonds were likewise strengthened by repeated exposure to hardship. Families, neighbors, and villages relied on mutual support for survival.
Generosity, reliability, and cooperation became highly valued traits. Those who contributed to collective well-being earned social capital that persisted across seasons. Those who hoarded, shirked, or failed in subtle, practical ways risked subtle ostracism or diminished trust. Winter functioned as an invisible arbiter, refining social norms through lived experience rather than formal enforcement. Over generations, these lessons were internalized, producing communities resilient not only to cold but to interpersonal strain. Winter also shaped morality in quiet, pervasive ways. Ethical behavior was closely tied to practical outcomes. Sharing, attentiveness, and foresight were morally and practically aligned. Conversely, selfishness or negligence could imperil not only individuals, but the entire household or village. Culture and survival were inseparable. Children absorbed this link between ethics and practical endurance through observation and participation. By adulthood, morality was not abstract, it was embedded in everyday decisions. How much food to save, how carefully to tend livestock, how to allocate labor. Winter had made virtue visible and measurable through tangible consequences. Even the spiritual life of peasants was informed by seasonal hardship. Saints associated with protection, endurance, and healing were quietly revered. Church rituals reinforced social cohesion, offered psychological support, and created rhythms that mirrored the seasons. Prayer, fasting, and observance were practical as well as spiritual. They structured life, maintained morale, and offered guidance during months when physical effort alone could not guarantee survival. Winter had intertwined faith and daily living so seamlessly that spiritual and practical concerns were almost indistinguishable. Stories and oral tradition continued to anchor culture and memory. Tales of past winters were retold to preserve knowledge, warn of risks, and reinforce social norms. These stories were factual and practical rather than dramatic, serving as guides for children and adults alike. They reinforced collective memory, ensuring that knowledge of survival, social expectation, and environmental observation persisted even if individuals failed. Over generations, villages built long-term memory archives, not on paper, but in the minds, habits, and behaviors of their inhabitants. As each winter passed, survival became a quiet triumph, cumulative and understated. It was not celebrated with fanfare or extravagance, but acknowledged subtly through daily life. Each household that endured another season demonstrated competence, prudence, and resilience. Each child who grew up under these conditions embodied learned endurance. Each community that emerged intact after harsh winters had reinforced social cohesion, mutual aid, and practical knowledge. In this sense, survival itself became an achievement, quietly monumental despite its lack of spectacle. Seasons, therefore, were not merely natural phenomena, they were teachers, organizers, and arbiters of social, ethical, and psychological life. Winter, in particular, demanded patience, foresight, and cooperation. It shaped work, relationships, moral judgment, and cultural memory. Peasants internalized these lessons, embedding them into identity. Surviving winter was not an isolated event. It was a continuous, cumulative process that defined the rhythm and structure of life year after year. Even as spring, summer, and autumn arrived, the lessons of winter endured. Preparedness remained central. Firewood was gathered well in advance. Grain stores were checked and rechecked. Clothing was repaired. Knowledge of past winters informed decisions about planting, harvesting, and communal cooperation. The cold months were never distant memories, they were reference points, quietly guiding action and thought across the warmer seasons. Survival was a year-round practice, not a seasonal concern. In reflecting on this, one realizes that medieval peasant life was defined by subtle triumphs rather than dramatic victories. Success was measured in continuity, the ability to move from one winter to the next intact, healthy enough to work, care for family, and maintain social bonds. Each small act of endurance, every careful decision, contributed to a larger tapestry of survival. Heroism was mundane, repeated daily, and cumulative. Endurance was not celebrated loudly, but it was recognized in social trust, communal cohesion, and the quiet satisfaction of having survived yet another season, what the natural world could impose. In this long, slow rhythm, life itself became a meditation on patience, observation, cooperation, and foresight. Medieval peasants, bound to their environment, developed a cultural, social, and psychological framework shaped entirely by the seasons. Winter was not merely endured, it was internalized, remembered, and integrated into identity. The cold months, the scarcity, the darkness, and the monotony were as much a part of life as the warmth of summer, the green of fields, and the laughter of children. They were formative, persistent, and quietly transformative. And so, as the cycle continued, one sees the full picture of medieval survival. A life structured by seasons, defined by endurance, and reinforced by repetition. The physical, social, and cultural lessons of winter permeated everything. By embracing this rhythm, peasants created communities capable of subtle cooperation, families capable of quiet care, and individuals capable of patience, observation, and resilience. It was a slow, cumulative achievement over circumstance, marked not by spectacle or wealth, but by continuity, reliability, and the quiet satisfaction of having survived yet another season. Winter, in essence, became the invisible spine of medieval peasant life. It shaped identity, morality, culture, and community. Its lessons were learned slowly, passed from one generation to the next, and internalized as habits, instincts, and rhythms. Survival was not an act of luck, it was the product of observation, preparation, cooperation, and the quiet persistence of ordinary humans responding to extraordinary constraints. Every year that passed added another layer to this living knowledge, reinforcing endurance as the defining characteristic of life. And in this understanding, one can see that medieval peasants, far from being passive victims of the seasons, were active participants in a long, quiet negotiation with the environment. Winter was formidable, but it was also predictable, codified into habits, stories, and social norms. The cold months were survived not by heroics, but by the persistent, repeated application of practical wisdom honed over generations. Survival became identity, and endurance became culture. It was a slow, cumulative achievement.
As the years rolled on and generations came and went, the cyclical nature of seasons became a meditative rhythm for medieval peasants. Life followed a pattern dictated not by ambition or desire, but by the slow, persistent pull of nature. Winter arrived, harsh and predictable, demanding labor, endurance, and caution. Spring emerged, tentative at first, offering relief and opportunity, but reminding everyone that the cold months would return. Summer provided abundance and warmth, but also carried the anxiety of preparing for the next scarcity. Autumn, with its harvests and shorter days, became a bridge, a time of work, observation, and reflection. Each season reinforced lessons learned from the last. In this way, the peasant's life was inherently cyclical, measured not in years, but in the slow, meditative progression of survival, preparation, and reflection. The meditative quality of this rhythm was reinforced by repetition. Tasks were performed daily, seasonally, and annually with remarkable consistency.
feeding animals, chopping wood, mending clothes, rationing grain, tending fires, each action repeated hundreds of times over a lifetime, each time reinforcing discipline, patience, and skill. Even the small, almost imperceptible decisions, like how tightly to swaddle an infant, how to layer clothing for warmth, or which path to take through a frozen field, were repeated enough to become second nature. Repetition, dictated by survival, became a quiet form of meditation. Mind and body moved in harmony with necessity, and attention to detail was cultivated not through instruction, but through experience. This rhythm extended to social life. Relationships were guided by necessity and shaped by cumulative experience. Families worked together with a tacit understanding of each member's capabilities. Neighbors cooperated quietly, knowing that trust and reliability were tested most rigorously during winter. Generosity, attentiveness, and foresight were practiced consistently, reinforcing social cohesion. Even minor transgressions or selfish behavior were corrected subtly, preserving communal equilibrium. The repetition of cooperative actions across seasons created a steady pulse in village life, one that guided both social norms and personal conduct. Emotionally, this cyclical life fostered a form of quiet resilience. The hardships of winter were anticipated rather than feared. Scarcity and monotony were integrated into daily expectations. Disappointment was tempered by preparation. Suffering, while inevitable, was contextualized as part of a larger rhythm. People learned to modulate emotional responses, conserving energy and attention for tasks that mattered. Patience, stoicism, and careful observation became second nature, internalized as traits necessary not just for survival, but for a meaningful, measured life. The meditative rhythm of seasonal labor and endurance shaped thought, temperament, and identity in profound ways. Even leisure, though minimal, followed seasonal rhythm. Storytelling, music, and simple games provided relief, but always in moderation. These activities reinforced memory, conveyed practical knowledge, and strengthened social bonds. Children learned to observe patterns, anticipate challenges, and interact with peers in ways that mirrored adult responsibilities. Laughter was muted and understated, humor dry and gentle, reinforcing community cohesion and providing subtle psychological relief. Entertainment, like labor, became part of the rhythm of life, reinforcing endurance and continuity rather than indulging excess or distraction. Religion intertwined seamlessly with this seasonal and meditative framework. Daily prayers, seasonal festivals, and observance of saints' days provided both structure and psychological support. Saints associated with endurance, protection, and healing were quietly revered because they represented stability and continuity in a life dominated by uncertainty. Church rituals created temporal markers, coordinated community activity, and offered moral guidance. Faith reinforced the rhythm of labor, preparation, and reflection, integrating spiritual and practical life. The passage of time, marked by seasons and religious observance, became both predictable and comforting, a constant in an otherwise fragile existence. Winter, in particular, left its mark on identity. Endurance was measured by consistency, observation, and subtle acts of care. Survival required more than individual effort. It demanded social cooperation, emotional discipline, and cumulative knowledge passed across generations. Each season built upon the last. Each hardship refined skill, patience, and judgment. Children absorbed these lessons effortlessly, becoming adults who understood the intricate rhythms of survival. The repetition of seasonal labor, observation, and cooperation created a culture in which endurance was a defining feature, and survival itself was quietly celebrated as an achievement. This meditative approach extended to the perception of time. Days, weeks, and months were measured less by calendars than by natural markers. Sunrise and sunset, the thickness of frost, the patterns of wind, the behavior of animals. Life was lived attuned to these rhythms. Planning, labor, and social interaction were all governed by seasonal change, reinforcing awareness, patience, and foresight. Time itself became a framework for reflection and preparation, integrating experience with anticipation. People moved through life in synchrony with the natural world, learning to read subtle cues and adjust behavior accordingly. Even challenges that might seem overwhelming in modern terms, harsh frost, scarcity, illness, infant mortality, were met with calm persistence. Winter demanded this mental adaptation. Panic, improvisation, and extravagance were dangerous. Instead, people relied on the steady accumulation of skill, knowledge, and community cooperation. Each small action, repairing a roof before snow, storing grain for weeks, tending the youngest and oldest carefully, was a repetition that reinforced resilience. Over a lifetime, these repetitions became instinctive. They created a meditative, enduring life in which survival was less about heroics and more about continuous, deliberate practice. In reflecting on medieval peasant life, one realizes that endurance was both practical and philosophical. The cyclical nature of seasons, the repetition of tasks, and the constant negotiation with scarcity shaped not just survival strategies, but worldviews. People learned to value continuity over novelty, stability over extravagance, and cooperation over individual gain. Their culture, moral code, and identity were interwoven with the demands of the environment. Life was structured, deliberate, and slow, shaped by the meditative cadence of survival. Winter, harsh and unyielding, was the teacher that imparted these lessons with quiet consistency. By the end of the year, when warmth returned and green fields reappeared, the peasant's life was a testament to quiet triumph. Survival was not celebrated with fanfare, but acknowledged in every act. A well-stacked firewood pile, a household intact, a child growing stronger, a community functioning cooperatively. Continuity, not spectacle, was the measure of success. Each generation added to the repository of knowledge, skill, and experience, ensuring that the next could face winter with the same quiet, practiced endurance. Winter, though formidable, was integrated into identity. It was no longer merely a season, it was a persistent framework shaping thought, action, and community cohesion. In the end, medieval peasants achieved a remarkable form of continuity. Their lives, structured by repeated hardship and quiet reflection, exemplified resilience in its most understated form. Endurance passed from parent to child, reinforced through routine, observation, and cooperation, became the core of identity. Knowledge accumulated imperceptibly across seasons and generations. Social bonds, moral norms, and practical skills were inseparable from survival. Winter, in its relentless, predictable way, shaped not only bodies and households, but entire communities, creating a rhythm